Again, still happy to be here despite the rain. So Ljubljana looks quite beautiful even in darkness. Well, painting and sculpture are, of course, luxuries consumed in affluent societies, which means that Scandinavia, a region characterized by poverty until the 20th century, produced little art until the 19th century. And only Copenhagen had a significant cohort of collectors before 1850. The relationship between art and politics was also different in Denmark and Sweden, sovereign nation states for centuries, than it was in Norway and Finland, which were virtual nations until the 20th century when they gained political independence. From 1814 until 1905, Sweden and Norway existed in a so-called union in which Norway was semi-autonomous but ruled by Sweden. The British forced Denmark to cede Norway as punishment for its support of Napoleon. So Sweden acquired Norway. Finland, on the other hand, was administered by Sweden from the 13th century until 1809, when it became a Russian duchy. These conditions are important for understanding national self-images, how national identity was fostered in these countries, and how paintings assumed political valences often invisible to outsiders. National membership was much easier to determine in Scandinavia than elsewhere in Europe, since territorial and linguistic borders were closely aligned. Danes, Swedes, and Norwegians could understand one another, although their languages were quite distinct. But Finnish, with its roots in Central Asia, could be understood only by Finns. Because linguistic and territorial borders were well defined and historical and cultural differences palpable, Scandinavian artists living in Paris during the 1870s and 1880s must have been frustrated by the inability of French art critics to distinguish among the various nationalities of Scandinavian artists. Germans were German, Italians were Italian, but Danes, Norwegians, and Swedes were Scandinavian or Nordic, and Finns were identified either as Scandinavian or Russian. According to French art critic André Michel, who commented on works shown at the 1889 Paris Exposition Universelle, quote, "It is something like a breath of fresh air, a bracing gust from the sea, from the Rocky Mountains and from the glaciers, that moves through the small rooms occupied by the artists of the far north," end quote. This observation identifies the first political issue faced by Scandinavian artists working in the late 19th century as an international center-periphery issue, which I guess you're probably familiar. Sufficiently little was known about Scandinavia on the continent, so little was known about Scandinavia on the continent that it was easy for critics and the public to assume an unjustifiable degree of homogeneity among the Scandinavian nations. The cultural marginalization resulting from this erroneously homogenized view was a key motivating factor for many Scandinavian artists who sought to establish a kind of aesthetic national sovereignty through subject matter, but also through material and technique. This false perception of homogeneity was particularly frustrating for Scandinavian artists who sought acceptance at the Paris Salon. While for French artists, the Salon in the late 19th century represented the despised academic establishment, for Scandinavians, as for other international artists, it represented international recognition and prestige. In 1886, Hugo Birger recorded the annual breakfast of Scandinavian artists held to celebrate opening day of the Paris Salon. Here the excitement is palpable. Scandinavian artists were pretty successful at the Salon. Many had works accepted and some even won medals. This unfortunately did not translate into sales in Paris, however. Parisian dealers like Durand-Ruel favored French artists, and Scandinavian paintings were apparently not so different or appealing to Parisian collectors that they chose to purchase them. Young Swedish artists had many passionate discussions about how to address the situation because their standing in Sweden wasn't much better. Jorg Pauli described it this way, quote, "The Academy, its incontestable power, participated in all the most important issues concerning art. Without its approval, there could be no promotion, no secure employment, no special honors, no stipends or state support, no recommendations for public or quasi-public commissions," end quote. Many members of the Paris Scandinavian art community returned home in the 1890s, inspired to establish national schools of art. Their return coincided with increasing industrialization, which produced a sufficient number of bourgeois art collectors to form native art markets that eliminated the need for artists to seek clients on the continent. As a result, many Scandinavian artists stopped measuring themselves against foreign benchmarks and sought instead to produce works that were authentic embodiments of local characteristics, both regional and national, as well as the opportunity to express social and political convictions in a manner transparent to their countrymen, but often imperceptible to outsiders. In Finland, the ruling Swedes encouraged national identity based on language, but it was not until 1892 that Finnish, the language of the peasants, achieved parity or equality with Swedish as a national language. As a buffer against Russification, the Swedes encouraged a sense of Finnish identity through the assemblage of the Finnish national epic Kalevala, created by Swedish philologist Elias Lönnrot and first published in 1835. Lönnrot embarked on a project similar to that of the Grimm brothers in Germany. He traveled from village to village, mainly in Karelia on the Finnish-Russian border, and recorded folk tales, myths, and songs that until that point existed only in oral form. From them, he wove together a narrative that told the story of the Finns from the creation of the world until the birth of the first Finnish king, a story that is intimately connected with the adventures of the shamanistic, if tragic, hero Väinämöinen. The Russians were also eager to reinforce Finnish national identity, but in their case, the motive was to weaken ties with Sweden. The Russians' concern was understandable for several reasons. Not only was Swedish the official language used in government administration and journalism, but the western part of Finland was Swedish-speaking, more affluent and better educated than the Finnish-speaking peasant populace, and constituted the nation's intellectual elite and bureaucracy, the only potential threat, at least initially, to Russian hegemony in Finland. The best-known illustrator of the Kalevala is Axel Gallen-Kallela, who Finnified his Swedish name, which was Axel Valdemar Galén, in 1907. This in itself was a political act, since he was from a Swedish-speaking family in Western Finland and the son of a lawyer. By changing his name, Galén declared his identity not as a Swedish occupier, but as a Finnish nationalist, which by that time was understood to include a desire for an independent Finland. As you see here, Gallen-Kallela radically reinvented Väinämöinen in the 1890s, a choice that reflected his own eagerness for Finnish independence, an ambition he shared with an increasing number of Finns. Actually, he didn't do so much reinvent Väinämöinen as select an incident from the Kalevala that revealed the hero's militant side. Earlier representations of Väinämöinen, whose luckless and desperate search for a wife constitutes the epic's main tragic narrative, show him as a gentle, Homer-like poet nestled in the nurturing nature of Karelia, as you see in the images at left. He sings his tragic story to the accompaniment of the singular Finnish instrument, the kantele, a kind of hammered dulcimer. By the 1890s, the kantele itself assumed political significance. It symbolized the rootedness of contemporary Finnish culture in the ancient past and the determination of Finns to preserve their peasant culture rather than embrace Russian culture or the cosmopolitanism of Finland Swedes. In the Kalevala, Väinämöinen's kantele, which he made from the jaw of a fish and is visible at the lower left-hand corner of Gallan Kalala's painting, has magical powers, which he used to help Ilmarinen, who made the sampo, which is a talisman with magical powers. He helped him to steal this sampo back from the evil witch Luhi. The moment that Gallan Kalala shows here is when Luhi, having discovered the sampo missing, transforms herself into a bird and attempts unsuccessfully to retrieve it. Luhi, who appears here aggressive, elderly, female, and only partly human, is demonized to represent the antithesis of all that is considered authentically Finnish. She is fought by determined human males who, with the exception of Väinämöinen, appear youthful. But even Väinämöinen possesses the wiry strength of a physically fit man, with his age evidenced only by his mane of flowing white hair. The painting was commissioned by the businessman Salomo Vuorio, who was a Finnish nationalist and, like Gallan Kalala, Finnified his last name, which was originally Backberg. Intended for Vuorio's dining room, the collector acquiesced to his wife, who hated the painting, and allowed Gallan Kalala to sell it to the Turku Art Association for what was then the fantastic price of 4,000 Finnish marks. Turku is located in western Finland and is really kind of the capital of the western segment of Finland. And the fact that defense of the sampo wound up there indicates the national solidarity existing between Swedish and Finnish-speaking Finns, as well as escalating enthusiasm for an independent Finland. The situation in Denmark was similarly affected by politics. Because of its location on the European mainland, though, ties especially to the German states had always been strong. As a result, the ideas about national identity articulated by Goethe and Herder in their 1773 essay Of German Character and Art were eagerly embraced by Danish intellectuals. The purge of German intellectuals from the Danish civil service following the execution of Johann Friedrich Struensee, a German doctor who was briefly the de facto reform-oriented ruler of Denmark in the early 1770s, strengthened Danish patriotism. Following Struensee's execution, the Danish bureaucracy was Danified, with Danish now becoming the official language rather than German, and Danes replacing all Germans in all government positions. In the 1770s, a sculpture park reinforced national pride. Danish Prime Minister Ove Høegh Guldberg commissioned sculptor Johannes Wiedewelt to make a kind of outdoor pantheon consisting of monuments to influential Danes and Norwegians from all fields, the arts, military, literature, engineering, philosophy, history, poetry, and science. Danish patriotism was further reinforced when the British Navy destroyed Copenhagen and the Danish fleet in 1807. The humiliating loss of Norway to Sweden in 1814, coupled with the forced cession to Prussia of the provinces of Schleswig and Holstein in 1864, reduced Danish territory by more than 75% in a century and had a decisive impact on Denmark's self-image. In this historical context, one might find it surprising that paintings from Denmark's Golden Age, what we usually call the Biedermeyer Era, from the fall of Napoleon in 1815 to the revolutions of 1848, this defined Danish national identity in a manner that was self-evident to Danes, but incomprehensible to outsiders. Considering its devastating loss of territory, the destruction of its national capital, and the subsequent economic depression, one might have anticipated a more xenophobic, militant strategy for satisfying the wounded egos and reduced fortunes of Denmark's ruling class. But instead, the Danes evidenced pragmatism and ambition in both economics and politics. Denmark became a constitutional monarchy in 1849, and in less than 2 decades after its war with Prussia, instituted agricultural reforms that rewarded it with a surplus economy based on the export of pork and dairy products. At the same time, Denmark's National Liberal Party controlled politics from the 1830s to the 1880s and instituted educational reforms designed to give Danes a sense of civic responsibility and national belonging. One of the most influential politicians of the time, Orla Lehmann, observed that, quote, "Politics is the politics of culture," end quote. In Denmark, national identity reflected the ideals of Copenhagen's urban bourgeoisie, and these ideals included simplicity, a quality seen in crisp contours and unpretentious interiors, modesty, a quality evident in the small scale of Golden Age paintings, and in the relaxed expressions and comportment of figures, order, apparent in the clear relationships between figures and the normative scale between figures and their seemingly airless settings. These qualities indicate control as well, but a control of a particularly benign sort. In Denmark, these qualities were touted as the essence of Danishness. In German artist Johann Erdmann Hummel's painting, for instance, a soldier, the main instrument of government control, is the closest figure to us, and in the background are the 2 symbols of institutional power, the church on the left and the royal palace directly behind the granite bowl. In Hansen's painting, in contrast, authority is nowhere in sight. The principal subject, instead, is Copenhagen's newest cultural institution. For Danish artists and intellectuals, Danish identity went hand in hand with the citizens' respect for social order, one that emphasized cooperation and consensus. This, in fact, is the basis of Denmark's successful welfare state, whose premise is that a cooperative society has fundamental moral responsibilities to ensure the well-being of its citizens. Understanding how Danes understood their landscape and how they interpreted images is crucial to properly understanding the meaning of Danish painting in the decades around 1900, especially those from the artists' colony at Skagen. This remote village was for centuries the windswept and desolate home of subsistence fishermen. But in the second half of the 19th century, it was transformed by the presence of artists and the city ways they brought with them. Skien became, as Kreuer suggests here, an icon of cosmopolitan Danish affluence, health, happiness, and fellowship. Hip Hip Hurrah was and is beloved by Danes because it embodies their self-perception of comfort and sociability. While Denmark was small in terms of size, population, and political significance, it had made significant progress in the 19th century, as Kreuer shows. It abandoned the traditional vision of a nation-state's status as determined by size and by its exercise of power on the international stage, outmoded values that were considered by Danes as relics of the absolutist past. Instead, Denmark embraced an agenda of responsibility for the prosperity and security of all its citizens. This revised national agenda indicated a modern political position that emphasized social equality and moral responsibility. Although clearly depicting a more somber occasion, Skien artist Anna Anker's painting of a child's funeral exhibits a similar element of social solidarity to that of Kreuer, along with what were perceived as the cardinal Danish qualities of modesty, simplicity, serenity, and order. Whether representing scenes indoors or out, paintings by artists working at Skien showed the spread of national identity from the center, from Copenhagen to the periphery, and there was nowhere more geographically peripheral than Skien on the northernmost tip of the Jutland Peninsula. Even today, it's about a 3 or 4 hour train ride from Copenhagen. One could interpret this situation as a kind of indigenous bourgeois colonialism, and in a way it was. But it is important to remember that the benevolent intentions of Copenhagen's artists, intellectuals, and bureaucrats, who fostered acceptance of these values through education and by extending the benefits of a welfare state equally to all Danish citizens. Exhibition possibilities were extremely limited in Denmark, as elsewhere in Scandinavia, and the only regularly occurring exhibition was held annually at Charlottenburg Palace by the Royal Academy. Exhibition judges were all Academy members, and they excluded artists unwilling to conform to its standards. For this reason, progressive young Danish painters formed a secessionist organization, the Free Exhibition, in 1891, which was inspired by the example of the Swedish Artists' Union, which I'll discuss presently. The Free Exhibition was established by artists, many of whom studied briefly at the Academy in the 1870s and 80s, then became disillusioned and enrolled in the private independent artists' study school established by landscape painter Wilhelm Kuhn in 1871. The founders of the Free Exhibition included Johan Rode and Jens Ferdinand Wilhelmsen, who worked in styles generally considered symbolist. The Free Exhibition's first show was held in 1891 and included 100 works by 18 Danish artists. Amazingly, when the Free Exhibition applied to the Danish government for financial support, it immediately received it, instead of being ostracized for its anti-establishment attitude. The Danish government's rationale was that the state should support all its artists in a non-judgmental way, which meant that this secessionist group was just as deserving of state funding as the Royal Academy. In 1893, the architect Thorvald Bindesbøll designed a wooden exhibition pavilion near Copenhagen's City Hall, which was used by Free Exhibition shows until 1898, when a replacement structure was designed by the artist Wilhelmsen. This building is still used by the Free Exhibition today. In 1893, the Free Exhibition also internationalized its annual exhibition by including works by Van Gogh and Gauguin. Gauguin's wife Mette was Danish, and she lived in Copenhagen and owned a large collection of her husband's works. The 1893 exhibition was attended by most avant-garde artists in Scandinavia, and the immediate impact, especially of their exposure to Van Gogh and Gauguin, is obvious. Norway and Sweden were similarly concerned with national identity in the 19th century, but this did not become a matter of significant concern until the 1840s, when Sweden instituted 7 years of compulsory education, a practice initiated in Norway already in 1827 and in Denmark in 1809. Compulsory education shaped the minds and hearts of its citizens, and Sweden's campaign, Know Your Country, largely determined the content of school books in both Norway and Sweden, where only 2 series of books were used by all children for their 7 years of education. These books shaped ideas about national identity to the extent that by the 1870s, there was, as in Denmark, broad-based consensus about what it meant to be a Swede and a Norwegian. Education was designed to provide citizens widely dispersed across a vast area with an understanding of domestic geography, political history, literature and cultural traditions, including those of ethnic minorities, particularly the Sami in the north and the Finns of central Sweden. Norway, in many ways, followed the pattern of Finland, where governing foreign powers allowed their protectorates great autonomy. Unlike Finland, however, Norway had no national epic and found its epicenter of identity in nature and peasants. In Norway, peasant identity played a crucial role, but this was more for linguistic than cultural reasons. The official variant of Norwegian used by the bureaucracy and urban Norwegians, referred to as bokmål or book speech, was heavily influenced by Danish. Norwegian nationalists in the 19th century, like Arne Garborg and Andreas Munch, Edvard's uncle, lobbied for the replacement of bokmål by a newly formulated Norwegian language called landsmål, or rural speech, based on a synthesis of Old Norse and local dialects of Norwegian peasants. The goal was to peel away the layers of foreign influence in language, but also in culture, in order to create an authentic indigenous expression of Norwegianness. This belief was shared by progressive Norwegian artists like Edvard Werenskiold and Christian Krogh, teacher of Edvard Munch, as well as who were both members of the Skien artist colony. In an 1886 article published in the Oslo newspaper Aftenposten, Werenskiold observed, quote, "We went to Paris, learned the Frenchman's unfamiliar, if healthy and logical thought process, and understood that we must restrict ourselves to nature, to our own nature, and that our own nature that we know and love. So we came home," end quote. Werenskiold was speaking here about art politics. Artists who had studied in Dusseldorf with Norwegian painter Hans Gude controlled the jury of Norway's only regularly occurring annual art exhibition, which was organized by the Oslo Art Association. The jurors included Peder Arbu, who produced detailed-oriented, sentimental genre paintings, and Philip Barlag, who practiced conventional Barbizon-style naturalism. Werenskiold and his politically progressive colleagues rejected the notion that imported values were best and embraced Norwegian folk culture and landscape as preferred motifs. This choice implied a political stance in solidarity with the largely disenfranchised peasantry and urban poor, a position Krogh's 1893 painting makes clear. On the 17th of May, 1814, Norway's legislature signed a constitution hoping to avoid union with Sweden, and held annual parades to celebrate it. These celebrations attracted increasing numbers of participants as the nation moved towards independence in 1905. The fact that Krog shows the then illegal Norwegian flag rather than the legal Union flag, which appears at lower right, positions him unequivocally as an pro-independence. But patriotism and national solidarity could be expressed in other ways. Gerhard Munthe, for instance, created tapestry designs that were woven by Frida Hansen. This one won a medal when it was exhibited at the 1889 Exposition Universelle in Paris. Norway, much more than its Scandinavian neighbors, had an extremely rich tradition of painting and design, one characterized by a kind of horror vacui, or fear of empty space, as you see in the designs at right. Munthe's embrace of folk art, in terms of material and technique, as well as motif and style, evidenced an anti-establishment and pro-Norwegian folk culture stance. Munthe claimed, quote, "The nation has, like the individual, its own predispositions and its own likings, just as it also possesses its own train of ideas," end quote. To create in a manner that was considered embedded in indigenous tradition denoted authenticity. Authenticity, in turn, suggested both social solidarity and rootedness in local culture. In earlier generations, rootedness would have meant rootedness in a particular regional culture, Telemark, Hardanger, or Romsdal. But the institution of compulsory education, combined with a modern sense of national identity, allowed Norwegians to feel that all the various local cultures of Norway were their own. This belief that the common bonds of indigenous culture and tradition were more important than, say, class differences was a political conviction that allied Scandinavian adherence to the larger internationalist social movement then underway. Landscape played a central role in Scandinavian national romantic painting. Artists focused on motifs familiar to their countrymen from either personal experience or else from the school books they had all read. Part of the ambition of national romantic artists was to highlight aspects of national culture that differed from foreign ones. This was the motivation for artists working in the Norwegian Fleskum colony in the mid-1880s. In these paintings, both Pettersen and Schieland focused on the long, light days of spring and summer. Schieland's image was clearly painted on a summer evening, since the water lilies have closed for the day, and the landscape is bathed in an even, diffuse light, the gray sky suggesting that it is one of those damp, chilly Scandinavian summers. Pettersen shows a moment from early spring, indicated, if nothing else, by the fact that the boy plays a flute made from a willow branch. Willow branches are soft enough to hollow out and make a flute with only in the very early spring, and it was a common activity in rural Norway, as probably also here in Slovenia. Neither artist adhered to the structured formula of academic landscape painting, and both avoided drama and narrative. As with the Danish paintings discussed earlier, one might find here modesty, order, simplicity, and serenity. But here these qualities describe scenes that are definitely not Danish. They are too hilly and wild for that, but ones that were typically Norwegian. In Sweden, art politics were the most fraught. They came to a climax when conflict arose between the government-sponsored arose between the government-approved history painting artists of the Royal Academy, exemplified here by Royal Academy professor Gustav Cederström, and the younger generation of egalitarian and democratically oriented progressive artists who spent much of the 1870s and 80s in Paris. As was the situation in most nation states at the end of the 19th century, government officials preferred traditionally executed patriotic paintings in which the message of patriotism, self-sacrifice, and loyalty to the monarch were promoted. In Sweden in the mid-1880s, a significant rift developed between supporters of the Art Academy, which represented the status quo, and the so-called opponents, a group of more than 80 anti-establishment male and female artists who in 1885 demanded absolute freedom in aesthetic matters. Jörg Pauli described the situation in Sweden this way. I think I read this already. Did I tell the quote of by Pauli previously? Okay, I'll read it again in case The Academy, with its incontestable power, participated in all the most important issues concerning art. Does this sound familiar to you? Okay. Without its approval, there could be no promotion, no secure employment, no special honors, no stipends or state support, no recommendations for public or quasi-public commissions. When the Academy banned opponents from participating in the infrequently held government-sponsored exhibitions, the opponents formed the Artists' Union, a group that considered itself part of the larger international socialist movement. The union's solidarity with the socialist movement is indicated by its choice of red as its signature color and its motto of Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, the French Republican revolutionary motto. The union retaliated against the Academy's ban by forbidding artists exhibiting at government-sponsored exhibitions from participating in those sponsored by the Artists' Union. And these exhibitions were much more frequent and more successful, both commercially and critically. The first exhibition, as you see here, was called From the Banks of the Seine. One might argue that Swedes did not have as pressing a need to inculcate a sense of national identity as did the potential nations of Finland and Norway or the reduced nation-state of Denmark. But politically progressive Swedes did not feel this way. For them, creating a generic national identity based on common experience and values had political urgency at a time when the social democratic movement to which they all belonged or sympathized with was in its beginning stages. Artists, educators, bureaucrats, writers, nature enthusiasts, and historic preservationists united in their ambition to evolve a nation-state whose first priority was the health and happiness of its citizens. For Swedish artists, the common ground that furnished the majority of motifs was, as you see here, landscape. Eugen, Larsson, and Nordstrom focused on typical summer conditions. Nordstrom on the intensely saturated colors of objects when the sun breaks through the clouds after a late afternoon storm, Eugen on the silence of the forest at twilight, and Larsson on the childhood pleasures of fishing peacefully on a summer day. The majority of Swedes at the time had extremely positive associations with these situations, even if they did not experience them directly. Fjestad shows the near daylight conditions of a moonlit night in northern Sweden when temperatures of 30 or more below Celsius subdue nature to the point that one can hear one's own heartbeat. While Helmer Östlund shows the vibrant colors of fall, that is to say, in Sweden, late August, where with the appropriate winter indicated by the snow-topped mountains in the background. Especially in Sweden, but also in the other Scandinavian countries, national romanticism and social democracy shared a similar set of values. Both were future-oriented and championed freedom, solidarity, and an interdependent relationship between people and nature. The very best example of a political painting that has been entirely misinterpreted outside Scandinavia is Richard Barry's Nordic Summer Evening. English and American scholars interpret this image as a moment of interpersonal conflict, since the couple does not interact and the space between them seems emotionally charged. A New York Times critic described this painting as showing the aftermath of a Strindbergian outburst. Scandinavian audiences, however, understand the image instead as one in which a bourgeois couple, awed by the beauty of nature on a cool, quiet summer evening, are united spiritually in quiet contemplation. They detect no interpersonal tension, and none was intended by the artist. In fact, what Barry also wanted to show was gender equality, an aspect that becomes clear from reading the artist's numerous writings and studying his preparatory sketches. I have arranged them here in chronological order. In the studies on the left, the man is in the dominant position, standing while the woman sits, or functioning as the support against which she leans. On the right, the woman is more independent and equal. She views the landscape alone in the image at the top right, and in the two below, she appears equal in size and comportment. On a neighboring page, I'm sure you're not going to be able to read this, but Barry wrote, you'll have to trust me, our vitality lives as long as we feel that our individuality and our humanity develop hand in hand, end quote. Barry was a close friend of the feminist and socialist Ellen Key, and part of the circle that regularly attended informal gatherings to discuss art, literature, and politics. Among this group, gender equality was fundamental to its view of civil rights. The political sympathies of the Swedish artists affiliated with the Artists' Union is evidenced also by the fact that many of them donated works to the newly built Facos hus, or houses of the people. Similar institutions were built throughout Europe by social democrats as meeting places for people who were not privileged enough to become members of private clubs or to gather in the stately spaces of hotels or restaurants. Facos hus usually contained libraries, performance spaces, and meeting rooms for activities as diverse as embroidery, lectures, and political meetings. The donated works, examples of which you see here, do not necessarily have explicit political themes, but they do affirm the solidarity of these artists with the social democratic cause. Patronage in Scandinavia, particularly Jewish patronage, was extremely important for National Romantic painters. In Denmark, Heinrich Hirschsprung supported Peder Severin Krøyer, leader of the Skagen artist colony, which also attracted international artists like Gauguin and Edvard Munch's teacher Christian Krogh. The beer-brewing Carlsberg family were also important patrons who collected both Danish and foreign art. Because of state support for the free exhibition, the National Museum Hagen was the only one in Scandinavia that collected avant-garde art from the very beginning, including works by artists such as Agnes Slott-Müller and Wilhelm Hammershøi. In Sweden, there were three important collectors around 1900. The artist, the painter Prince Eugen, whose home in Stockholm is now a house museum open to the public. Ernst Thiel, a Jewish banker whose home near Prince Eugen's is also open to the public. And the third important Swedish collector, also a Jewish banker, is Pontus Furstenberg, who donated his collection to his local museum, the Göteborg Museum of Art on the west coast of Sweden. Furstenberg had strong egalitarian convictions and believed, like William Morris in England, that a beautiful environment promoted individual harmony. For this reason, he commissioned several mural projects, including the stairwell of the Göteborg School for Girls in 1891, where Carl Larsson painted frescoes depicting the influence of women in Swedish history from prehistoric times to the present. Furstenberg also funded an art school in Göteborg with Carl Larsson as the primary teacher, and was the main patron of the short-lived Varberg artist colony situated in a beach resort south of Göteborg during the mid-1890s. Larsson was based there in the summer, as were Carl Nordström, Nils Kruger, and future National Museum director Richard Berg. But some artists, more or less one from each of the Scandinavian countries, achieved international fame and fortune, but partly at least because of their ability to socialize. I'm sure you're familiar with Edvard Munch's scandalous 1892 exhibition in Berlin, which was the catalyst to the formation of the Berlin Secession. And in 1895, there was an exhibition held by gallerist Ugo Baroccio in Berlin, a joint exhibition of Edvard Munch and the Finnish titan Gallen Kallela, which was a critical success. A few years later, the Swede Anders Zorn, who was also extremely skilled at socializing, held an exhibition at Durand Ruel in Paris. He was the illegitimate child of a brewery worker and became, later in life, the sailing companion of the Swedish king and painted the portraits of 3 American presidents. So he was really good at networking. Durand Ruel actually exhibited very few foreigners, and so it was quite a distinction that he held an exhibition of Zorn's work. Zorn, Munch, and Gallen Kallela, rather than spending most of the 1890s in their home countries, as did many of their avant-garde compatriots, spent a lot of time in Paris and Berlin, forging connections to dealers and important critics and publishers like Hervarth Walden. Galleries in Scandinavian capitals also began exhibiting avant-garde art, both native and foreign. The gallery of Tycho Salonen and Gösta Stenberg in Helsinki showed works especially by German expressionists and represented the innovative Finnish modernist Helen Scherfbeck. In 1913, a relative of August Strindberg opened the Sven Strindberg Salon in Helsinki and specialized in contemporary art. His first show in 1914 included both French Cubist and German Expressionist painting, a show he produced in cooperation with Hervarth Walden's Der Strom Gallery in Berlin. In 1916, Strindberg also showed in Helsinki works by Russian artists Chagall, Tatlin, Rozanova, and Kandinsky. In 1913, the same year as the Armory Show, the American Scandinavian Foundation sponsored the first ever exhibition in the United States dedicated to Scandinavian art. It was shown in New York, Boston, Chicago, Toledo, Ohio, and Buffalo, New York. Here, for the first time, American audiences could see modern Scandinavian art. Interestingly, and perhaps because of the daunting impact of the Armory Show, the exhibition had little noticeable impact on American artists, but on a large contingent of Canadian artists who at that time were struggling to develop a singular Canadian visual language distinct from their neighbors in the US. Artists now known as the Group of Seven traveled in January 1913 from Toronto, where they lived, to Buffalo, where they recognized a similar landscape in the Scandinavian paintings presented there. Similar geography, similar wilderness, similar light. Although National Romantic artists did convince some of their younger compatriots to remain at home in order to develop authentic personal styles in harmony with their heritage and their inner creative voices, other artists of the younger generation wondered why they should stay at home when their teachers, who originated singular individual styles congruent with national or regional identities, spent their formative years in France. They knew from reading contemporary cultural journals like Word and Picture in Sweden, Art and Culture in Norway, the Studio in England, Pan in Berlin, Jugend in Munich, or the Versacrum in Vienna, that there were many exciting and inspirational international art currents to learn about. These young artists followed in the footsteps of their teachers and went to Italy, Spain, and especially France, where in the early 1900s they saw retrospectives of Gauguin in 1906 and Cézanne in 1907. Many enrolled in the Académie Matisse, which opened in 1907 and operated until 1911 under the direct supervision of the celebrated and innovative modernist Henri Matisse. The Swedes Sigrid Hjertén and Isaac Grunewald studied with Matisse in Paris from 1909 until 1911. They were impressed by his free treatment of color and form, elements that they incorporated into their own painting. They participated in exhibitions at home, particularly at Liljevalchs Kunsthal, a space for contemporary art designed by architect Carl Bergsten that opened in Stockholm in 1916, with money donated by Carl Friedrich Liljevalch Jr. Grunewald and Hjertén belonged to a group known as the Matisse students, who shared with the French master an interest in folk and non-Western art, simplicity, and a belief in the independent expressive nature of color. That Grunewald and Hjertén shared a similar aesthetic approach to Matisse is evident. According to Grunewald in Matisse's Joie de Vivre, quote, "People and animals, trees and flowers, earth and sky participate in an inseparable collaborative rhythmic line and color symphony," end quote. But this new trend was not appreciated by nationalist critics. In 1910, Albert Engström launched a passionate attack against Matisse and his students. In the journal Strix, he declared, quote, "I think that Matisse is stupid as an artist, but clever as a deceiver of youth. It's not difficult to draw and paint badly, unless you're an artist, of course. I wonder if Matisse is an artist. What can he do?" End quote. Engström actually spoke for the majority of Swedes who found it difficult to understand the aesthetic merits of Expressionism. In 1913, Swedish artist August Brunius introduced Expressionism to the Swedish public in a brochure entitled Color and Form, Studies of the New Art. There he explained that, quote, "Expressionism is not a school, is not only a new method, but is primarily a feeling of defiant youth, of the need for independence, of a violent reaction to the demands of reality," end quote. In the summer of 1914, a pan-Baltic exhibition opened in the southernmost Swedish city, Malmö. Here in the Swedish pavilion, Grunewald and Hjertén first exhibited under the name Expressionism. An anonymous critic for the daily newspaper Sydsvenska Dagbladet ranted, "And then comes Grunewald and his friends, and here one stands for a while in amazement, wondering and speculating if this can be really called art." Grunewald wasn't alone in this condition of weakness that painters seem to be trapped in. There is an entire group of artists that paint similarly, end quote. The Swedes were not the only expressionists in the Baltic exhibition, though. Clay, Kokoschka, Mark, and Clay, Kokoschka, Mark, and Munter exhibited in the German pavilion, and Kandinsky in the Russian pavilion. The international attention that this pan-Baltic event might have attracted was undermined by the outbreak of World War I at the end of June, which halted virtually overnight the tourism upon which such exhibitions depend. In 1918, Grunewald published the essay The New Renaissance in Art in connection with an exhibition of 450 Swedish expressionist works at the Liljevalchs Kunsthall. He explained expressionism's goal as, quote, simplification, grandeur, expressiveness, and clarity, end quote. To wash away all the inessential details from the visual, and instead of trying to present an objective, detailed picture of reality, to give a synthetic, nuanced picture of the seen and experienced, end quote. In order to win public understanding, Grunewald explained that Expressionism was nothing new, but rather a rediscovery of art's origins dating all the way back to the Stone Age. Interestingly, one artist of Sweden's national romantic generation, who I have not mentioned yet, Jörg Pauli, returned to Paris in 1911, largely because he saw what was going on in journals and because of the influence of the Matisse students who had left Sweden. He was eager for new inspiration. He studied with the cubist André Lotte and frequented the Stein Salon, where he met major figures of 20th century modernism. And Pauli and a number of these other Swedish artists, and Edvard Munch, I didn't talk about the importance of monumental painting and public wall painting, but that was also an extremely important trend in early 20th century Scandinavian art. Well, I apologize for neglecting the other Scandinavian sections for Sweden in the final section here, but they too did have Matisse students and underwent similar national developments in art patronage and politics. In this brief overview of Scandinavian painting, I've tried to show that art and politics were related there, but frequently in ways that weren't obvious to outsiders. Thank you.